Hi,
Hi.
Roz. Hi. I've apologized to everybody for the technical mess up that essentially was
I thought
my
it
fault.
was
Uh,
I thought it was my side, and I'm panicking. And I was like, I was in, then I couldn't get in, and that's like, oh my gosh, what have I
yeah,
done?
I'm not quite sure what happened either, but anyway, we're here now, which
Okay.
is amazing, and it's great to see you, Roz. So, um, a lot of people said hello to each other, which is always nice. We have an international
Oh,
crowd as usual, which is also nice.
oh, wonderful. Okay.
Um, Okay, so I'm going to turn my self off and hand over to you, Roz. And thank you very much for giving the presentation today. I'm sure everybody knows who you are, so I'm not going to do a long introduction or anything like that. So I am going to leave it to you. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, everybody, and let's get started. Hopefully, you can see my screen. So I apologize in advance. Once I've shared my screen, I won't be able to see any comments in the box, but I'll try to leave some time for questions at the end. Okay, so when is a patient not a patient? So the the title patient in itself is quite loaded. You may or may not have thought about this, but particularly for patients with chronic illnesses, the term patient is sometimes not appreciated. Now we're going to look a little bit more at labels and of course the power of language. We all know the power of language because we work in this industry, but we're going to look specifically at two types of language: patient first language and identity first language. Now please don't worry if this is the first time you've come across either of these terms. Actually, as a slight correction already, it's person first language, not patient first. So already I need to correct that. So person first language and identity first. That isn't even correct either. We're going to look at how we might look at these two issues with our students and implications for materials design. So quick correction, that's person first language and identity first language, apologies. So first, a little bit of dancing. Probably not what you were expecting on a Thursday morning in an healthy conference, in an healthy webinar, but you're going to get a little bit of dancing. All I want you to do is to watch and listen. Now, some of you may have heard of a competition called Strictly Come Dancing, and this is whereby famous people, actors, comedians, etc., are paired up with professional dancers and they learn how to dance. Now, I just want you to and watch and listen particularly.
Roz, there's no sound on the video, unfortunately.
Oh, really? Oh, I'm so sorry. This is not
Sorry.
going well for tech today. Okay. Well, the purpose of this dance, just to let you know, is that at some point in this dance, just at this point here, the music suddenly stops, but the dancers continue dancing. And the dancer in question is a woman called Rose Ayling-Ellis, who some of you, if you're British, you probably know about this person. She's an actress and she's a deaf actress. And this particular dance won a lot of accolades. And in fact, she went on to win this competition. And the fact that this dance is a dance delivered by a deaf person is very pertinent to what we're going to be discussing today. So, as I said earlier, we all know the power of language. We are linguists, we work in healthcare, and we know that good use of language, which is inclusive, values-based, can lower anxiety, build confidence, educate, and help to improve self-care. And then conversely, we also know that poor communication can be stigmatizing, hurtful, and undermining of self-care and have a detrimental effect on clinical outcomes. So the language that we use, the language that our learners use, and the language that we train our learners to use is so incredibly important for lots of different reasons and for lots of different patient groups. And we'll come back to Rose, the actress the dancer you just saw, in a moment, because as I say, she's very pertinent to this whole discussion. So quite often we use language is used to describe various aspects of the patient journey. And quite often we use metaphors. And the metaphor of war is probably the most common. We talk about killing viruses, fighting the war on SARS and AIDS, winning the war on cancer, and fighting to save a patient's life. A lot of that language sort of assigns a role of victim to the patient. And that can be a sort of a passive role, which doesn't always help the patient. And then from the healthcare professional's perspective, that can give the sense of sort of failure. What if we didn't get that patient through their cancer journey? Have we failed as healthcare professionals? It has a really, really detrimental often effect on the relationship between patient and healthcare professional. So often this type of language and these metaphors, they demotivate, they blame and they judge, they often shame as well. And we'll see an example of this in a moment. So language tends to also, or this type of language can belittle the patient and infantilize them as well. So all in all, it sort of disempowers them. And let's have a look at one example. So we're going to look at two particular patient groups. And first of all, we'll look at patients with diabetes. And here are a couple of quotes from patients who live with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So I hate diabetes. It's so hard for me to control what I eat and doing everything. And it's such a big effort. So that idea of controlling glucose levels, controlling diabetes, that language control is quite, it can be demotivating, clearly demotivating for this particular patient. And then on the right, we've got another example. So being described as non-compliant is awful. It doesn't reflect the fact that everyone is doing their best, maybe not the same best as everyone else's, but even their best is best, but it's just the best that they can do at that particular moment. The issue with type 1 diabetes or any type of diabetes is that it's given top priority, but sometimes life gets in the way. So there's a lot of perceptions around patients with diabetes from the language that is used to describe them. Yeah, they're non-compliant. They can't control their diabetes. And this is quite common. And this sort of language shames and blames the patient, which can sort of lead to distrust and sort of senses of dissatisfaction with the relationship that they have, not only with their condition, but also with the healthcare professionals that are treating them. Yeah, and that can increase errors in terms of management and can be discriminatory and very alienating. So the diabetic patient, now there's a label, the diabetic patient. problem with using these sorts of labels is that they can result in sort of healthcare inequalities. And now a patient might sort of have a particular perception of themselves and their condition, and they might not actually always disclose what they want to discuss during a particular encounter. And an encounter with a healthcare professional who might see that the patient has diabetes, that might sort of overshadow the whole encounter. This idea of diagnostic overshadowing, and assuming that the patient is there to discuss their diabetes or their chronic illness or their mental health condition. And that might result in missed opportunities because that might not be the reason for their visit. In the 1990s, there was a refusal to be treated as victims. And this refusal was by patients living with AIDS. And there was this wonderful quote at the time: "We condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term that implies defeat, and we are only occasionally patients, a term that implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS." And this came from the National People with AIDS movement. And since the 1990s in the US, healthcare professionals have been taught to use patient-first language. And this was written into the American Disability Act in 1990. But what is patient-first language? Now, I have asthma, and I could be described as an asthmatic. But if we're going to be using patient-first language, we're going to describe, or they're going to describe me as a person living with asthma. Yeah. In scenarios of mental health, we might not talk about a schizophrenic. We're going to talk about a person living with schizophrenia. And in the area of social care that I know some people work in, we might not want to refer to somebody as a homeless person, but person experiencing homelessness. Now, the idea is with person-first language is that the disability or the condition is just one element of that whole jigsaw of the person's identity. And it places the person before their diagnosis, essentially. That's the idea. And then working towards separating the two. So the disability being a descriptor and not the embodiment of the person. And I use the word person as opposed to patient, yeah, because we're not always patients. And of course, this brings me to my favorite quote, which if you've seen my presentations before, you may well have seen so many times before, but I just love it. And it works perfectly here to describe person-first language. So the idea behind everything that we do in healthcare is the person-centered approach, or the patient-centered approach, following on from William Osler's "The good physician treats the disease and the great physician treats the patient who has the disease." So in terms of labeling, we've solved the problem, right? Maybe not. So I wanted to go back to Rose Ayling-Ellis. And these are some of the quotes that she gave at a really, really fascinating talk she gave for the Alternative McTaggart talk in 2022. It's nothing to do with healthcare per se. It's about it's for media professionals, I believe. But if you have a chance, watch it. It's really, really inspiring for lots of different reasons. But some of the quotes I picked out tell us something about what deafness means for Rose. So I'm disabled because I live and work in a world that disables me. I'm bilingual, so meaning that she uses uses speech, and she also uses sign language. Being deaf has its own culture. Okay, so here we're seeing a difference here in terms of what deafness means. Being deaf is my proudest identity. So we're moving slightly away from person-centered, person-first language. Now, I want to show this as an example of how we try to help our healthcare professionals in making sure that they use the right type of language. Now, this is from 2022, so it's fairly recent, and it's a set of guidelines from the American Psychological Association. And it's a writing guidelines, guidelines for writing. So writing in terms of any sort of patient leaflets, written patient communication. And it suggests that instead of using the term hard of hearing person, we should use person with hearing loss. Now, that would work with the formula for person first language, yeah, person with hearing loss. Same for blind person, that we should use the same formula, person with blindness. Well, I'm sure that actually sounds a little bit strange to us. And I'm sure if we were to ask Rose Ayling-Ellis what she thought of these terms, she might not actually agree with them, because the idea with hearing loss is that there's some kind of deficiency or inadequacy. And although that follows the person-centered, the person-first, formula, it wouldn't necessarily be what some, say, like Rose would actually appreciate. So here we come to identity first language. Now, a definition of identity first language is that, as the name suggests, it's where an individual's identity is the core component of how you represent them within your practice. This comes from a healthcare professional, as you can appreciate. So I think this demonstrates what Rose was trying to say, with the fact that deafness is really integral to her identity. And she would probably reject person first language and opt for, and indeed opts for identity first language. So there's a different perception here. And so there are different patient groups that reject the whole idea of person first language. And for a lot of the reasons that Rose cited in her talk. It isn't just the deaf community that reject person first language. The autistic community also reject it. And this is some of the reasons that are cited here, is that with person first, there's a sort of an attitudinal nuance to the language, which is not appreciated. And as far as the autistic community is concerned, autism is an intrinsic part of their identity. It's an inherent part of their identity. Autism is considered a different way of perceiving and interacting with the world, which I suppose so too is the same for the deaf community. And so autism is integral to the identity of that person and their sense of self. I hope this is making sense, by the way. So problem solved, right? No, not quite. When I looked into this in a little bit more detail, because the research into this is absolutely fascinating, and I really would encourage you to look into it. It really, really is fascinating. I found that when I looked into the research into identity first language, parents of children with autism didn't appreciate it at all. They felt that describing their child as autistic stigmatized them, and they preferred to use person first language and refer to their kids as children with or living with autism. And the same was the case with healthcare professionals working in this field as well. They dislike the sort of negative connotation behind describing children as autistic. So it's very important to get it right, and it's not that easy, um, as I'm sure you can appreciate. But I love this quote that, moving towards language that empowers. Language is a vessel through which patients are connected to the right treatment at the right time. So what we need to be doing with our learners, as with English as a second language, is to make sure that they are aware of the differences, that they understand the concept and the understanding behind those differences, and ensuring that they include the right type of language when they're speaking to their patients. And of course, as we know, language changes all the time, and sometimes we can't keep up with it ourselves, but that is part of our responsibility, to make sure that we do keep up with the changes, and ensure that what we are transferring into our classrooms is language that is appropriate, to the patients that our learners will be working with. So what are the implications for training? Well, I'm sure you've guessed this already. We have to broach the issue. And it may be, to a certain extent, there's a cultural aspect to this as well. So, we can talk quite a lot about inclusivity, etc., in the British context, for example, or the Australian context, or the US context. But we do have to be aware that those contexts may be quite different from what our learners are used to, and from the healthcare practice back home. And of course, when we broach these subjects, we create discussion, and we can encourage our learners to be agents for change. Obviously, we're going to be using role play. Obviously, I'm not going to, there's nothing new in that. But we need to maybe adapt some of our role play scenarios to include person first and identity first language. The discussion that it isn't just a question of semantics. There are real patients behind those words. There are real people behind those words, and those words have real impact on them and the outcomes for their treatment and their healthcare. There are style guides available. I wouldn't advise necessarily the one that I showed you earlier, because that wasn't quite getting it right in 2022, but there are style guides available, particularly if you work with patients living with diabetes, or those in the autistic community. There are style guides on how to write patient leaflets and patient information, and we can use those. We can use those in our classrooms as well and adapt them for our use. So one that I would suggest is Language Matters, Language and Diabetes, that was produced by NHS England. Now, it was produced in 2018, so it's a little while ago now, and they may have updated it since. But they give some advice on how to approach language when working with people living with diabetes. And it is really an excellent document, and it's for free. You can download it for free, no problem. Just Google it. So the advice is, avoid the idea of control, recognize the impact of diabetes in the patient's life, the whole patient-centered, person-centered approach. Ask about the patient's perspective and use their language. Yeah, mirror and get your learners to mirror the language of their patient. And when the language isn't appropriate, then encourage your learners to be more aware of the tone and the non-verbal signs that the patient is, that the healthcare professional is projecting themselves, and then in return, what the patient is demonstrating. Do they appreciate the use of person-first language, or do they prefer identity-first language? And then at the end, sort of obviously encourage your learners to demonstrate empathy, we know that, and to thank the patient for sharing their perspective and their preference in terms of the type of language that they prefer to be used. And of course, our learners are going to make mistakes, and in the type of language that they use. They may, start with person first and realize that that's the wrong language to use. It should have been identity first. But the advice on that is that, yes, mistakes will be made, but apologize briefly and move on. Don't allow your learners to go into some whole explanation of, I should have used that and I really apologize, etc., because it kind of makes the situation worse, as you can appreciate. So advise your learners, apologize briefly and move on. That's what the patients would appreciate. And when in doubt, the recommendation is to default to person-first language. Unless we are talking about specific communities where we know that identity first is more appropriate, i.e. autistic community, the deaf and blind communities. Other than autism, in mental health, usually you would use person first language. However, as we saw at the beginning, a person living with schizophrenia. Of course, I asked ChatGPT about this and what they thought, and could they come up with some role plays for me? And I entered a couple of prompts. So please create a dialogue. I always use please with AI. I don't know why. A dialogue between a GP and a new patient who is deaf. The GP wants to find out if the patient prefers person first or identity first language. The GP needs to be very empathetic to the situation. And it did give me a nice little dialogue. It was actually quite good. And then I thought, well, let me feed in another prompt, write another dialogue with where the GP uses person first, but the patient prefers identity first, and the GP is forced to apologize. And again, it came up with something that was definitely usable. So we can make use of AI. Even AI has heard of the difference between person first and identity first language. So thank you. If you have any comments, I would be more than happy to hear. Or any questions? These are my references. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Roz. That was insightful, illuminating as ever, and a really lively chat as the
Really? Okay, I
talk
wasn't able
was
to follow, I'm
progressing.
afraid.
Yeah, I know. One of those things when you say
I
share
can
your screen.
only
I mean,
do
if
one
you have
thing
a
at a
look at
time.
it, yeah. There's lots of really great debate around language and how it changes and the kind of various pitfalls involved with it and so on, and a
Yeah.
lot of stuff about the kind of stuff that we bring with the language that we then choose to use because of the stuff that we're kind of programmed to do and so on. So really interesting stuff. Can you see the chat now? Shall I
Oh,
just give you a moment to
I sure.
and if anyone's got any particular questions that they would like
Yeah,
Roz
I
to
can always
have a
read
think
the
about,
chat afterwards. Yeah.
yeah. Ping them into the chat box
Oh gosh.
now, or we can enable voice, I think. Would anyone like to contribute anything?
I'll have to read the chat later on because it looks like there's a lot of work. a lot of comments, which is
A lot of
great.
words. Yeah, a lot of words, a lot of words. Question from about AI tools.
Uh-huh.
And that was really interesting. Your one of your last slides there about how ChatGPT was able to produce pretty good dialogues with both person and identity first language. Super interesting, quite alarmingly good, I guess. Um, Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
a couple of things in the chat. Yeah, so I suppose AI is the first one. Whether there has anybody used any other AI tools apart from the obvious, and how are they working for people in terms of producing the right kind of dialogues? Any thoughts on that from anybody? And Roz, from you.
Ah, interesting. So Iona is using Notebook LM, free from Google. That's a new one on me. I didn't know about that one. So, um, right. So she says earlier that she could upload reference materials and get answers specifically. Yes, I mean, I know with ChatGPT, that's my only real experience is you can upload whole, you can upload PDFs and documents and it will analyze them and uh, make use of what you provide to it. Yeah, that's true. Okay.
Yeah, it learns
And
pretty
audio
well, doesn't it?
files as well. Yeah. Okay. Ah, all right. So I have to try that one out. That's a new one on me. Thank you, Iona. Any other questions? Everyone's gone silent now. There was lots of chat in the comments. Everyone's gone silent. I'm so sorry about the lack of sound, guys. The if you just Google into or Google or YouTube Rose Ailing Ellis, Strictly Come Dancing, that dance will come up. And it really is the most beautiful dance because sort of partway through, the music stops, they continue dancing, and you get enveloped into her world as a deaf person. And for me, that was such a shame that you couldn't because that was I didn't realize that you wouldn't be able to hear it, and I do apologize. Majella cites the talking about hearing impaired. Hearing impaired is one of those terms that suggests that there is some kind of deficiency and that people are inadequate somehow because they are hearing impaired. It doesn't give a positive notion, and to the patient, they don't really appreciate being referred to or the term used as hearing impaired. So that was an interesting as one as well that I came across too. Yeah. Any So Neil says the challenge here is the shifting sands between person and identity first. Reminds me of identity politics, making me wonder if there are instances of healthcare professionals being cancelled for incorrect choices. Oh, wow. Okay. That's an interesting one, Neil. I hadn't even thought about that. Um, for those people who are not so aware that the idea of cancel culture um, is quite prevalent in the UK. And so Neil's comment here, cancel culture. So there's a lot of people in the media, for example, who have been cancelled because they have used the wrong terms. And I think yeah, and so Neil's question is, has that moved into healthcare as well? It's a possibility. It's a shame that Virginia's not here with us today because she would possibly be able to enlighten us on that fact. I don't know if we have any healthcare professionals in the chat today who can enlighten us on that. It is a possibility, and that's yeah. Thank you, Neil. Interesting. Um, Asking the patient about their preferences. Yes, yes. And this is not something necessarily that our learners would think to do automatically. I mean, if we're training OET, then they're probably more likely to do that. But if we're not training OET candidates, then this is something that we need to encourage our learners to do. Margella, I understand there have been changes to those terms. They are changing slowly, and individuals' personal perspectives should inform how healthcare professionals communicate with them. Absolutely, absolutely, Margella. Yeah. So the idea of asking and thanking the patient for sharing, it helps to develop that trust, doesn't it? With the patient, and once you've developed it, to maintain it as the encounter progresses. Okay. Sorry, Iona, you asked a question about asthma. I saw a question earlier. This may feel a bit too personal, so feel free to skip. Could you share more from your experience interacting with healthcare professionals as a person living with asthma? To be honest, yes, I guess I've been called an asthmatic on numerous occasions. But for me personally, I don't have a problem with it at all. I never had, and I never really considered it. I guess there's not an awful lot of stigma attached to people who live with asthma, and that's the difference. I think that there is a certain amount of stigma attached to being a diabetic patient. For example, that idea of people with living with diabetes not being able to control themselves, their sugar intake, their glucose levels. Whereas asthma, it's more sort of people might feel sorry for you, but because you might struggle to do certain things, in the athletics world, for example, or in terms of your exercise, although not that I've ever had any problems with that myself. But that is an interesting debate. Yeah, for me, and I think most people living with asthma, it doesn't define them entirely. At least it doesn't me, but I don't have serious asthma. So I guess if I had serious asthma, that might be different. And yeah, it doesn't define me. But yeah, okay. Margella, that's interesting. Not all diabetics are the same. They only share a chronic autoimmune condition. What defines a person? Yeah, interesting. Yeah, yeah. And Helen Louise also, thank you, Helen. Just as all autistic people are unique with different strengths and challenges. No, absolutely, absolutely. And although the difference there with the difference between the autistic spokespeople of the autistic community, let's say, have suggested that it's recommended to use identity first. Parents are not necessarily in agreement and don't like their children to be referred to as autistic, for example. Again, it's this idea of stigma. All right, so fascinating discussion, guys, and I hope I get a chance to read it all later on. Thank you so much. That was really, really, really interesting to see your perspectives as well. Oh, Margella, yes, the difference between the adjectives and the nouns. Yeah. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay,
Helen,
shall we draw
yeah,
it to a close there,
thank
Roz? Is
you.
that okay?
Yes. Oh, yeah,
Kind of
absolutely. No problem
ran
at all.
over somewhat, but it's been a really fascinating debate and a really fascinating, actually, the chat throughout the talk was really interesting to follow. So thank you everybody for the contributions that you've made, and a huge thank you to Roz for giving us such an interesting talk and so much food for thought. There really is
You're very welcome.
a lot there to consider in the work that we do. So thanks very much, everybody. Say goodbye there. Enjoy your evenings, your afternoons, your mornings, and keep an eye on the Healthy website because there will be more webinars coming soon, as well as an exciting event in spring, which we will
Very
announce
exciting.
soon. So please keep your eyes open for that. Okay, enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll be in touch with each other soon. All right, bye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.